Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. Here's two things you might say on the very same day. My life's flying by. I thought it would never end. These contrasting expressions give a sense of our experience of time as fluid, complex, even contradictory. For example, how much time we experience is in part determined by how pleasant an experience is. Time really does seem to fly by when you're having fun. By contrast, if you're in chronic pain, then even a few minutes waiting until your next analgesic can feel like an eternity. How we experience time depends on what's happening, our age, our mental health, our motivation, our emotions, what drugs we've ingested, and the nature of our attention. For example, if we're looking backwards, at the present, or forwards. And how we perceive time makes a big difference to us. It impacts our mood, our well-being, our productivity, and our sense of meaning and purpose. We'll examine these issues and more in this series, but we'll start in this first podcast with the question of whether in fact we have less time in modern life, whether we suffer from the so-called time famine. It's very common these days for people to feel time is too short. They have too much to do with too little time, always feeling rushed and anxious about time. So, right now, ask yourself, do I have time to listen to this podcast? What comes up? Are you multitasking while you listen? Is there a sense of the competition for your attention? Very often the answers indicate a pressure we feel on our time. In fact, between 60 and 80% of Western country adults report feeling they don't have enough time. And this has consequences because feeling stressed about time has been shown to contribute to depression, anxiety, and obesity, among other bad things. From an existentialist point of view, of course, time is undeniably short. It's running out. There's no controversy there. But here we mean something else. Here we mean this widespread belief that we're working longer hours and have less time than our grandparents. Does that sound like you? So is this time famine a real thing? Are we, on average, working harder than our grandparents? Well, the short answer appears to be no. Somewhat surprisingly, it seems we largely create this feeling of deficit. When considering both paid and unpaid work, studies from the Centre for Time Use Research at the University of Oxford shows people in developed countries work fewer hours than they did in the 1980s. This conclusion is based on data gathered from nearly 30 countries spanning more than 50 years and covering 850,000 person days in total. So it's pretty solid. People routinely overestimate the amount of time they spend working. In the United States, for example, by 5 to 10% on average. And those who work the longest hours tend to overestimate the most. There are industries that buck this trend. Commonly, corporate lawyers, investment bankers, computer programmers, for example, routinely work 70 or 80-hour weeks, sometimes more, and are consequently more likely to be stressed, exhausted, or suffering mental ill health. They objectively have insufficient time to meet all of their work and personal demands. But what is the time and work reality on average? Over the past 50 years, men have reduced the number of hours they spend on paid work and increased those in unpaid work, and overall came out ahead with about 50 minutes more free time per day. Women are doing more paid work, reflecting their movement into the workplace, and less unpaid work, producing little change overall. However, this does not apply to single parents who are definitely spending more time in paid and unpaid work, and very likely working women still carry way too much of the burden of unpaid work. Anyway, this raises the distinction between objective and subjective time perception. In these terms, the time famine for the majority is less of an objective reality and more of a subjective feeling. Of course, if you're objectively too busy trying to do more work than you have time for, there are strategies you can and should adopt to deal with the reality of your busyness. Better planning, prioritising, paying others to do tasks to free up your time, or making time-saving purchases. All of these have definitely been shown to help, as we'll see. So this subjective experience of time poverty is well described by Ashley Whillans, a professor at the Harvard Business School, in her recent book, Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life. She points out that, quote, one of the reasons we don't feel like we have as much leisure as we used to, even though we have more, is that our leisure and even our work time is a lot more distracted. So what's going on? Well, I think the Protestant work ethic is alive and very well, and we've normalised, indeed valorised, busyness. I believe we suffer from a very dominant idea that leisure is wasteful and perhaps self-indulgent, and we've therefore changed the very ways we think about leisure. The busier we are, the more important, interesting and admirable we feel. We've confused productivity with self-worth, which makes the option to rest and sit and be still often fraught with guilt and disquiet. This tendency to busyness has been both enabled and supercharged by technology and social media. So when we check email or scroll through our social feed, we fool ourselves into thinking we're doing something productive. We engage in what Linda Stone once called continuous partial attention, a kind of continuous multitasking, keeping lots of plates spinning and keeping us hypervigilant so we don't miss out on something important. By glorifying busyness, even our leisure becomes work. As we engage in time deepening, we seek to do it all, to see it all, and to do it all and see it all now. In this way, time itself has become a scarce commodity. We insatiably fill time, and we're constantly watching the clock because we perceive that the opportunity costs of wasting our time are unacceptably high. Consequently, even leisure takes on an instrumental purpose. For example, socialising or relaxing for no reason may be avoided as wasteful. I might become impatient with activities that aren't immediately productive, or more focused on what I'm going to achieve with my leisure, where I'm going to eat and what that's going to look like and how I'll document it, rather than just sitting down, being really present and simply enjoying a meal with a friend. So how does leisure typically look in our digital world? It tends to be broken into tiny pieces throughout the day, rather than experienced in blocks. Long gone is the old 8 hours work, 8 hours personal life, 8 hours sleep. What has changed dramatically is how thinly distributed our leisure time is. Again, as Whillans put it, quote, our leisure time is sporadic. It's scattered because we're constantly connected to our phones. We're trying to do many, many, many tasks, and our attention is being pulled in many directions. Now, various authors refer to this as time confetti. Think of the bits of time between breakfast and starting work, or the 10 minutes between tasks, the small pieces of time between online meetings, or the half hour in the evenings when your chores are done but you're not ready for bed. What are you actually doing with those moments? For most of us, digital devices fill all these gaps. They feed our distractibility, pulling us out of the present and undermining our ability to enjoy the leisure we have. Our fear of missing out, FOMO, is supercharged by unlimited access to images of others living their best curated lives. We're constantly aware of the things we could be doing that we're not. So we are chronically, psychologically in deficit. Technology also dissolves boundaries, with work increasingly overlapping with home life, especially for those of us who work from home. Devices make it possible for us to never leave work, and many don't. Forever at the beck and call of messages and emails, we all too often prioritise the urgent instead of spending undistracted time on what's truly important to us, like appreciating simple things. So, there are the issues surrounding the time famine. We have chronic anxiety about time, the leisure time we have is scattered across the day, and we have turned leisure into an instrument for productivity rather than a good in itself. I hope the time you've spent listening to this podcast hasn't depressed you too much. I promise. In the next podcast, we'll turn our attention to the practicalities of reclaiming the pleasure of leisure. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. And if you like the podcast, share it with people you like so they can like it too.